Tonight, we will explore the life, ideas, and lasting influence of one of the most important thinkers in modern American Judaism, Mordecai Kaplan. Through his groundbreaking vision of Judaism as an evolving civilization, Kaplan challenged Jews to rethink tradition, community, and religious life for the modern age. His ideas transformed American Judaism in profound ways, while also raising important questions that continue to spark discussion today. We are delighted to have you with us as we examine both the remarkable successes and enduring limitations of Kaplan's Reconstructionist vision. We extend our gratitude to Andrew R. Ammerman for sponsoring our summer 2026 lecture series in loving memory of Josephine and H. Max Ammerman and Stephen C. Ammerman. Sponsoring lectures is a meaningful way to honor or remember a loved one or to mark a significant occasion, such as a yard site, a personal or professional achievement, or a milestone celebration. Your sponsorship donations, as well as contributions at all levels, allow us to continue offering these lectures free of charge for all participants. For more information on this program and how to get involved, please visit our website. And now it is my pleasure to welcome today's speaker. Rabbi Dr. Bradley Artson is the American Jewish University Goldstein Distinguished Scholar and former Vice President of American Jewish University and Dean's Chair of the Ziegler School of Rabbinic Studies in Los Angeles. A leading voice in contemporary Jewish thought, he has written and spoken extensively on theology, ethics, science and religion, social justice, and inclusion. He also serves as rabbinic leader of the Abraham Joshua Heschel Seminary in Potsdam, Germany, where he helped establish the first conservative Masorti rabbinical seminary in Europe since the Holocaust. Rabbi Artson is the author of 12 books and more than 250 scholarly and popular articles. He is currently completing a new book, Judaism Beyond Belief: Wisdom for People Who Simply Want to Thrive. Lastly, we are especially grateful that Rabbi Artson serves as a valued member of the Haberman Institute Academic Advisory Council. And with that, I now welcome Rabbi Artson to join us. Welcome, Rabbi.
Thank you, Matt, and welcome everybody. It's a pleasure to be able to be with you. The miracle of this electronics continues to amaze me. So here we are, stretching all over the place, to talk about a paradigmatic thinker who was one of the very first to recognize the paradox of the power of Jewish tradition and culture and faith, and at the same time, the real challenges that contemporary civilization posed to Judaism, ways in which Judaism was in direct head-to-head conflict with core American values, and he proposed what he thought was a reasonable way to move forward. And I want to talk about this prodigious thinker. He produced an enormous amount, several wonderful books, kept a diary throughout his whole life, lived past 100, so he was productive through almost all of that. I want us to look at a paradox in his life as a way of our thinking about the relevance of his thinking and some of its challenges. And that paradox is he uniquely put his thumb on the pulse of American Jews and American Jewish life. He identified the tension points and the challenges. He came up with what he thought were reasonable responses, meaning responses people could embrace without falling out of sorts with their larger American commitments. And yet, what the ensuing years have seen is that while many American Jews have a kind of Kaplanian idea about Jewish life and Jewish values, they often don't know where it comes from. And in addition to that, it's kind of dwarfed by other movements within Jewish life, most especially, and what Kaplan wouldn't have expected, wouldn't have anticipated, was the rise of Orthodoxy. And that's true not only in Jewish community, but in religious communities across the board. the more traditional wings of religion have thrived in ways that are astonishing and unpredicted. And so we have to ask ourselves, what is it, both about contemporary culture and about Kaplan's thinking, that might have led to that unanticipated reality? As opposed to what I think he anticipated, he expected that traditional belief structures would wither and that Reconstructionism would provide a pathway for people to be Jewish in a variety of ways: Orthodox, conservative, reform, um, and that approach to Judaism could be then lived in a bunch of different practices. But that didn't happen. Reform is still vibrant, conservative is still vibrant. There's a beautiful Reconstructionist movement, but it didn't really thrive numerically. It didn't explode the way Kaplan expected to. It didn't become the Judaism of every American Jew or even most American Jews. It's still relatively numerically small, but with a mighty impact. So I want us to look at all of that, and I want us to do it, if you don't mind, come with me to a place of curiosity and not of judgment. Meaning, I hold Kaplan in very high regard. He was a brave, courageous man who took on the really big issues, even though there was no guarantee of success. And the fact that some people have rejected his ideas or find them troubling, that should be encouraged in any debate. Um, but it doesn't take away the breadth of his vision, the enormity of his proposals, and his ability to integrate the best of contemporary thought with what he viewed as a redoing, a reconstructing of Jewish sources and practice to fit the modern age. Ready? So that's going to be what we're going to look at. We're going to look at the intellectual, religious, sociological background that he faced. We're going to look at some of the main points of conflict. We'll look at his Copernican revolution, he called it, and what it entailed to remake Judaism in a way that he felt was much more compatible. And then we'll look at why that didn't catch on. What might have happened that stopped it from being more popular than it otherwise would. And then the last part is I'd like you to think with me about what are the successes? What succeeded overtly? What just kind of became so common that everyone thinks it but doesn't know where it came from? And what are the ways that we can take some of his productive ideas and take them to their next steps? So that's the agenda, and I'm going to dive right in. The conflict was a chasm. From antiquity through the medieval period, Judaism was communal and coercive, meaning it wasn't a matter of individuals deciding if they wanted to affiliate or not, or what ways they wanted to affiliate, or how much they wanted to practice. It had the impact of a coercive communal structure. Rabbis in various cultures had access to punishments, to fines, to beatings, which really focuses the mind when it comes to religious practice. And so Jews inherited, both for good and for bad, the notion that religion was at the very center of your identity. Whether you like it or not, that's your business. But the community could compel you to observe according to communal standards. All of that eroded with the modern period. What changed now was that the worldview changed, the economics changed, the sociology changed. All of that shifted in ways that we still are dealing with. So let's unpack that one by one. The first thing that Kaplan noticed was that the ancient and medieval worldview divided the universe into two categories: supernatural and natural. The natural category was the physical world, the world of cause and effect, the world of a chronology. One thing happens after another, and everything has a prior cause. But what he noticed was that in that division, and then of course, supernatural is those aspects of reality which do not pertain to time or space, right? So, in that view, the sacred is eternal, meaning time doesn't pertain to it. That's different than saying, for example, if God is eternal, that's not the same as saying God is really old. It's saying old and young don't apply. So God is outside of space and time. The world to come is outside of space and time. The angels, paradise, all of these things exist eternally. They are eternally true, and in some way that no one ever explains, that supernatural world intervenes on the natural world and is able to influence things. So, a God who has no body and is outside of time, nonetheless, is able to show up at the right moment and split the sea so that Moses and the children of Israel can pass. That timeless, non embodied God thunders with a voice at the top of Mount Sinai and hands a very detailed Torah to the Jewish people. And the authority of the Torah is not, for most traditional voices, the intrinsic wisdom of the text. The authority is its source. It comes from God, and therefore you're obligated to it. Now, in that world, there's an explanation, and that explanation was really cogent until fairly recently. It was, in fact, the only intellectual game in town. The only way you could explain consciousness, complexity, diversity, change, was to have recourse to this natural supernatural. The human being is a composite made of natural elements that make up our body, but our soul is a piece of God put inside that material body. So there is eternity within each of us, and that eternity is where consciousness comes from, it's where soul comes from, it's where our emotions come from. And no one had a better explanation. But came modernity, and all of a sudden we have thinkers like Charles Darwin who come up with a theory of evolution in which matter complexifies itself without the need for a supernatural intervention. And make no mistake, once a scientist said there's no need, what they're saying is there's no room. So that not only wasn't there a possibility of a supernatural intervention, there's no space in Darwinian evolution for an intervening God. God can't be an actor in the drama in any conventional sense. In that scientific worldview, we now start to understand more recently genetics and the role that genetics plays. And that has all kinds of very troubling effects on the way people perceive the world. We can now see that if you have brain damage, excuse me, that changes your personality, which makes it feel an awful lot like the biochemistry of your brain shapes the contours of what we used to call a soul. Maybe there's no need for a soul. Remember, no room for a soul. Maybe all we are is a pile of biochemistry, and that's sufficient to explain everything. That scientific worldview wreaks havoc on any traditional religion, right? Certainly within Judaism, the idea that a supernatural, non corporeal God dropped a book on us, and if we follow the rules in that book, we will merit eternal life, which will take us outside of space and time into an eternity of bliss and paradise. Beautiful vision, gave generations of people deep meaning, hard to sustain when you see the world as a great big material machine. And where you explain the workings of that machine, that is to say, the universe, the cosmos, by recourse to its component parts. I'll say what that means. So We understand the basic level of physics and how elements interact at the level of physics. They complexify into combinations of elements at the level of chemistry. Chemistry interacts. Still no room for a supernatural soul. If you understand that chemistry enough, at some point it becomes self-replicating. It starts to emerge into some primitive way of maintaining homeostasis, its own balance. That balance becomes biology, right? And so biological creatures can be explained physically by their chemistry, one layer down by their physics. But again, there's no place in a biology class to talk about, well, where does the soul emerge? When does the soul enter into a fetus? You can't ask those questions in a biology class. Right? And that means that all of a sudden, the way we explain the world has to have a basis in both experience and verifiable reason. So notice what gets left out. There's no space for intuitive leaps. There's no space for, I don't know, two of the really important things in Judaism, miracles and revelation, right? That doesn't explain how we got to where we are. Um, and to extent Judaism is dependent on those two things. The creation story is a miracle story. A supernatural God decides spontaneously to make all of material creation, which happens over 6 days, and the seventh day God rests. And at that point, the story begins. Right? But the scientific story is billions of years, and the way you know things is not because someone told you, not because you take it on faith, it's because there was an experiment done and you accounted for the data, and that allowed you to explain it and you verify it. If the experiment turns out differently than your hypothesis, then you have to throw it out and start again. And even someone who doesn't have credentials, if their experiment displaces some other person's prior claims, the status of that person is irrelevant to the conversation of what's the truth. Truth in a scientific world is established by a combination of empirical reason, meaning reasoning that you can poke and test and verify and falsify, and experience. That's radically different than the way traditional Judaism knows things, right? It's radically different than the way traditional Christianity knows things or Islam. In all three of those cases, Abrahamic faiths, you know things by opening a book and commenting on it, interpreting it. The rabbis teach us, turn it and turn it because everything is in it. The way you know the world is by reading Torah. But that's not true in the scientific method. It's a lovely book. It's a great book. It's fine. It's right up there with Gilgamesh and the Iliad. But it's not where you turn to know truth. So that's a big displacement. And in its stead, revelation assumes the ability of a supernatural being to suspend or violate the laws of nature. You can't do that in science. There is no violation of natural law. The laws are the framework that explain whatever you're going to explain. So you may need to tweak your understanding of natural law. Some piece of data may tell you you got it a little bit wrong, you'll change it. But there is no simply, well, we suspended the law that day. All of that puts a huge stress, which is to say, kind of breaks it for traditional religion. One manifestation of that was the rise of capitalism. In the free enterprise system, people's value is determined on the market. If you can't exchange it and you can't get currency for it, it's worthless. So the fact that it has some deep ethical meaning, some memory to you, that's not how the culture and the economy allocate value. We value what makes a profit. It generates more capital. And again, I'm not advocating or criticizing. I'm just pointing out that that's entirely different than a system where what is of value accords with the divine will as revealed by scripture and by rabbinic commentary. So that too throws the standards of traditional Judaism up in the air. And already by Spinoza, we have intelligent, thoughtful attacks on that mitzvah system and an alternative system of values. But the modern age threatens to wipe all of that away. Two more things. Traditional religion in its Islamic, Christian, and Jewish forms is hierarchical. There are authorities who are not selected by the people necessarily. They are ordained by God, right? And they speak with authority within the framework of that revelation. So in theory, a Muslim ruler has to live in accordance with the Quran, a Christian ruler in accordance with the Gospels, a Davidic king in accordance with Torah. But outside of that, do what you want. You're the king, right? But the scientific age, because it shifts to verified experience, is a democratic age, small d. It's an age in which the people make the decision that they want, and power follows their decision. We're witnessing that now with these midterms. The people vote. There are ways you can try to sway their vote. You can give money to a good cause. You can try to lobby. You can walk around and persuade people. But ultimately, the people get together and everyone gets a vote. And that's also profoundly threatening to a system, for example, of rabbinic law in which nobody votes. The rabbi decides. You go to an expert, the smarter the expert, the better. They look at the sources, they hear your argument, and then they make a decision based on not what people's preferences are, but based on what the law is. And so scholars who have tons of legal books on their shelves, rabbis, imams, priests, ministers, they are the authority in traditional religions, and it's not like you can appeal through a vote. But in the modern age, you don't have to consult any clergy. You don't have to consult anyone's scriptures. You get to just decide for whatever reasons you decide, and then you cast your vote along with everyone else who casts a vote, and that determines the outcome, like it or not. That's radically destabilizing to the entire structure, in our case, of Jewish law. And that's how mitzvot get decided. So if you need to do mitzvot to enter paradise, two things that have already, as you've seen, been thrown into question, then you're still going to have to deal with the fact that in a democratic age, if you don't want to consult a rabbi, you don't have to. You're not automatically a member of the Jewish community. You don't even have to be a Jew if you don't want to be a Jew. You can just leave. And you don't even have to leave physically. You can just make the decision on your own. I'm not affiliating with anything that has to do with it. That's a distinctly modern position, an option that didn't exist in the old world. And that also changes because Judaism was not a private spiritual path in the ancient or medieval age. It was deeply spiritual, don't get me wrong. I'm a big fan. But nobody in the pre-modern period thought that you observed Judaism so you could feel good or feel at peace. The only pre-modern explanations are you do it because God told you to, or the rabbi who speaks on God's behalf told you to. But suddenly in the modern period, that approach to religion as um, coercive communal standards separate from popular will takes a nosedive. Even among most observant Jews in America today, they still straddle this line of voting in elections, and listening to the rabbi when they want to. But surely mine is not the only synagogue where people sit in the pews and after a rabbi's sermon, they say, "Oh, I liked it. I didn't like it. I agreed with this part. I didn't agree with that part." That didn't happen in the medieval period. It did not happen in the Talmudic times. Who are you to evaluate God's word? Well, you're the creature of the modern period. You are a citizen, another concept that never existed in antiquity. You're a citizen. And that gives you your status, not you're being part of a religious or ethnic community. Last thing I want to highlight for you as part of Kaplan's recognition of the crisis Judaism was in his time and still to this day, is the role of civilization, culture, art. Those weren't seen as separate categories. The fact that there was artistic creativity, lovely, but that's understood in Judaism as Hidur Mitzvah, as enhancing a commandment. It wasn't for its own sake. It's not beauty for its own sake. It's beauty for the sake of making you more open to doing the mitzvot, to honoring God. You save your best food for Shabbat because you want to honor the Sabbath. But the idea that people spend a lot of time on aesthetics for aesthetics' sake, beauty for its own sake, that's a very modern idea. And that also undercuts certain notions that had lived up until then. Aristotle, in his writing, and neo-Aristotelians believe that there are objective criteria for what makes music good, what kind of pacing, what tonality. And they're willing to write books in which they tell you what's the right kind of tone and tempo and pace. But we recognize that these are all culturally shaped and that cultures can make very different choices for which there's no general appeal. Meaning you can decide you don't like a particular modern style of art or music, and that's your business. But if enough people like it, it's going to continue and it will continue to have an influence and will speak to and for a lot of people. So Kaplan looks from the balcony at this looming chasm. Traditional Judaism, with its cluster of values, natural and supernatural, salvation as opposed to capitalism, miracles and revelation as opposed to natural law, democratic values versus hierarchy, um, citizenship and civic engagement as a standard rather than simply commanded. And the notion of these timeless Platonic ideals as opposed to the aesthetic being a reflection of contemporary popular culture. And Kaplan says there has to be a shift. Judaism is in crisis, and it's going to be in crisis so long as that split exists. So the answer that he wants to come up with is a way for contemporary Jews in his time in the 30s, 40s, 50s to be able to have a Judaism that is not incompatible with modernity. On all of those categories, we have to reconstruct Judaism. And he believed that that was possible. Now, he relied on thinkers who aren't themselves Jewish, but that's true, by the way, of all Jewish philosophers throughout the ages. Aristotle influenced Maimonides. Plato and Aristotle influenced Sadia Gaon. All philosophers within Judaism, within Christianity, in theology, are impacted by the general philosophers who are teaching in their time. So he turned to pragmatism, people like C.S. Pierce and John Dewey. Pragmatism teaches that something is distinct if it makes a difference. So you don't try to understand something objectively in a timeless way. You ask what its impact is. What do people do differently because of that assertion or truth or thing? The pragmatic value of something is what determines its meaning, significance, identity. He was very influenced by Emile Durkheim and the emergence of modern sociology. the idea that people's ideas and identities are profoundly shaped not just by some platonic sense of good that they come up with on their own when they contemplate with their eyes closed, but rather that in the day-to-day interaction in society, we are shaped in visible and invisible ways. We assume what gender means, what's being a real man, what's being a woman, and this changes over time. That's one of the things we're all yelling at each other about these days is the radical shift in gender identity and our understanding of it. But one of the challenges is that sociology reminds us that these social norms are mostly invisible to the practitioners, to the community in which they're alive. And because of that, they feel inevitable. Our natural understanding, no, our social understanding feels like it's just natural. And it doesn't stop feeling natural until someone gets enough of a hearing and says, wait a minute, that doesn't have to be that way, or that's not how I understand it. And the first resistance is close to hysteria because someone is telling you up is down, green is red, day is night. That's what it feels like because your society imposes norms that don't feel chosen. They just feel true. So, so he's influenced by that as well, unlocking the social understanding of Judaism and religion was very important to him. And then the last was utilitarianism and William James, which is related to pragmatism, but the idea that you want to know what you can use something for. All of these are a revolt against Plato and the idea that there are abstract, timeless truths that are unchanging and that we have access to them somehow through abstract reason. So, in all of these cases, experience as lived is prioritized over absolute ideas. There's a mistrust of absolute ideas. People with authority want to tell you that their ideas happen to be those absolute ideas, but we've all learned through brutal history that that often is a power move and a mask. So you have to ask yourself, how does this idea function? What is it doing? What is its use that it's put for? And what does our society make of that in a bigger context? And that led Kaplan, in Judaism as a Civilization and many of his other writings, to make the following really amazing assertions. The first is he said, traditional Judaism assumes that God created the world, gave the Torah, and the Torah created the Jewish people. Saadia Gaon in the 9th century says that explicitly. But Kaplan says you've got it backwards. The people, once they have a sense of themselves as a people, the word he used was a nation, they generate the rules, the stories, the prohibitions, the Torah, and that comes after peoplehood. Our practices, our ritual practices, what he called sancta, they come after peoplehood, not before. And so things like Torah and sancta, mitzvot, these are derivative. For Kaplan, what's primary is the Jewish people have a sense of ourselves as a people. And this, for Kaplan, interestingly, is absolute. Nations do not have to justify their existence. Their existence is a brute fact. And nobody has to justify why it's okay that they're alive. No society has to do that either. Once you have a sense of yourself as a people, you are. And at that point, people are identified by their civilization. So you then go about the business of developing your civilization, which changes over time. And that's okay. All right. So what he focuses on then is what he calls the Torah idea, the God idea, the Israel idea. Now, notice the shift that he's made. People first, which is to say, experience first, more than abstract thought. And because of that, it doesn't matter if there's actually Torah actually God. What matters is our ideas about God. How we perceive the divine, that's what's significant. And so we construct ideas of God that reinforce and support our peoplehood. In each and every age, we do that. And we don't necessarily do it with deliberate self-consciousness. It's just how we talk about the world. I'll give you a small, for instance, of that. You heard that I've created a school in Germany to train rabbis. I had the pleasure of spending a Shabbat in Berlin years ago. The cantor was a Russian-trained cantor. And he sang many of the familiar melodies that I know from my American synagogue. But whereas Americans sing them in a positive major key, Russians tend to sing them in a minor key. You can hear the crying in it. And it's not that one is right and one is wrong. The nature of the culture is mediated through the totality of their experiences. Americans sing chipper, and Russians sing like, not so fast. That kind of invisible hand of culture naturally permeates how we think about God. In an age in which there are tribal chieftains, God is the biggest tribal chieftain. In an age where there are kings, God is king of kings. In an age where there are emperors, God is the emperor's emperor. And he says, in an age of science, where we are governed by forces, then God is a force. God is a power. God is a process. He uses all of those terms. That's true for Torah too. How we understand the meaning of Torah. Is it a particular book? Is it a set of books? Is it a set of books and a commentary? Or is it the guiding narratives and practices of the people Israel? Those are very different content, but one can legitimately fill each of those into the same slot. And so he spends a lot of time, more I think than any other Jewish thinker, defining what he means by God, by sacred, by Torah, by mitzvot. And he ends up taking a phrase from Matthew Arnold. He writes that God is the power that makes for righteousness, the power that makes for salvation. Right? Now that definition, okay, but it opens us up to asking, what is the nature of God's power? What is the nature of righteousness or salvation? And what he does not mean by that is after you die, you go to paradise. You get to eat delicious fruits in a garden. That's not what he means. He understands salvation to be self-thriving, right? So what does it take for you to live a thriving life? That, for Kaplan, is what salvation means. And that's what we're working on. And Torah, therefore, is not just a particular book or set of books. Torah is the insights and practices of the Jewish people that can help you thrive. And it's a social phenomenon. It's what we do together. It's what we build with each other. Notice how it keeps turning things around. Now, that means there are some things that you can reconstruct. He reconstructed what you mean by God. He reconstructed what you mean by Torah. He reconstructed what you mean by mitzvot, commandments. And then there were places where he drew a line, where he said, I'm not going to reconstruct that. I don't think you can. So one of those was the area of Jewish law. In an age in which we perceive the divine, our God idea is of king, then the law becomes binding because it's the will of the king. But we live in a democratic age. Things are established not because they're objectively right, but because a majority decides that's what they want to do. And for Jews to be Jewish in the modern age, that has to permeate our Judaism too. You can't, says Kaplan, be completely modern in your whole life and then inside your Jewish life retreat to the 1500s. So, so what would it mean for Jewish law to now be democratic? Well, He tried to implement that. You have communities where they study together, they debate together, and then they decide what they want. And notice that the big break he makes with some of the other more traditional forms of Jewish life is your study doesn't dictate your outcome. You might, in theory, discover that all of Jewish precedent is on one side, but you think we should all be on the other side now. That's fine. You get to make that call, you and the community. You don't decide that individually. We decide that as a group. But then that becomes what's normal for our community. So he didn't try to write a learned paper about the ordination, about bat mitzvah for girls. He just said, in our age, we think of boys and girls as of equal value. They're each part of the covenant. Girls should have a ceremony too. And that's a different way of practicing. What he emphasized more than halacha, a system of law, was takana, the ability within Jewish law for traditionally a rabbi, but now a community, to issue a standard. And for that standard to be binding for that community when they come together as a community. Here's how we understand the dietary laws. So this is how we will practice it in our synagogue. And if you want to invite people from the community into your home, you're going to need to practice it that way too. But that's very different than a pre-modern Jew who figures it out by opening up the Shulchan Aruch or a code of Jewish law and looking up what does it say. Very different approach. So takana as opposed to a legal system. And he also separated law from ritual. There's an argument to be made that in classic Jewish culture, traditional Jewish culture, there isn't a word for ritual. There's a word for commandment. There's a word for prohibition or imperative. I can say all of that in classical Hebrew. I can't say ritual. Because the idea that you just do a practice to stand for something or to remind you of a value, that's a modern idea, but it's one he embraces. In our day, he says, ritual is not a reflection of law. Ritual is how we symbolize and enact Jewish values, the values that we currently embody as a community. And so that means that the practices we do are open to change if they no longer meet the needs of contemporary Jews. It's a very different criteria. It's not look in a book to see what they used to do. You should do that because if you want to make a decision, the same way if you want to play jazz, you want to riff on something, you should know what classical pianists do too. But in the end, you're going to riff how you want. That's what Kaplan is calling for here as a value, as something he's in favor of. And then the final component that he argues for is what he calls ethical nationhood. This he gets partly from Ahad Ha'am, partly from Solomon Schechter, and partly on his own. The idea that Jews live in two civilizations. We are fully heirs of our Jewish culture, and here we are fully heirs of American culture or Israeli culture or European culture or wherever you are. And that's okay, right? It's not something to fix or to cure or to harmonize. You have a cluster of values and community as an American in this case, for me, and you have a cluster of community and values as a Jew. And they can have some overlap and they can have some separate identities and things that pertain to one and not the other. There's a way in which his Americanness became a kind of religion. He developed prayers for American holidays. He viewed them as sancta of the American people. Um, and these values are generated psychologically, socially, meaning they're not tracking objective truth. What they're tracking is a human need. And so that again reinforces Kaplan's idea of pragmatism, of what works. The last idea that he had in ethical nationhood that has done really badly is the idea of kehillah or Beit Am. He felt that Jews to be a community had to be able to have coercive communal structures. And so he wanted to argue for regional kehilot, communities that had governing boards, that had executives. And he said the synagogue can't do that. Synagogues are exclusive by nature. Everyone has to think the same. There has to be a certain level of income that lets you participate. There has to be a religious orientation. There has to be clergy. He wasn't against synagogues, but that can't be the central organizing principle of his new vision of Jewish life. For that, you're going to create secular organizations because they're all inclusive. And that secular kehillah, community, that will involve everyone in democratic self-rule. And that democratic self-rule is not only for Jews, it's for Judaism, right? Because our religion is the core component of our civilization, but is for him civilization. Now, that's a lot. That's his Copernican revolution. The people first, God and Torah afterwards. A sense of practice based on human needs, not based on abstract right and wrong. A sense that ritual is determined to meet the needs of the community and is separated from the classical halachic Jewish legal structure, and a sense that nationhood has to be an expression of the deepest values of a people. Every nationhood, including our own. And that's what he meant by Zionism, too, was that same ethical core. Now, what happened to that? Those powerful cluster of ideas that Kaplan really thought were going to take over, that he was self-evidently creating a way in which Judaism was re-envisioned so that it was fully supportive of and compatible with contemporary American values, which for him was the biggest impediment for Jews taking Judaism seriously. What happened? Well, a couple things I want to raise. You might have different criticisms to offer. Here's what I want to offer. He had a very high level of expectations for his people. He was chronically disappointed in his own congregation, in his own lay leadership, in his colleagues. He thought people weren't taking it seriously enough. And so he was often very unhappy with the people who had circled around him and saw themselves as his disciples, his congregation, his community. Um, he expected a very high level of learning. He expected a very high level of time and practice. And then as now, most people, for good or bad, don't do that, right? So most people then and now, they join a synagogue because it's in the neighborhood, because I like the rabbi's sermon, because my friends go there. Um, and they don't make a commitment to turn over their whole life for the sake of the process of being a participant in that community. Well, Kaplan couldn't stand that. But in a way, his vision of Jewish life requires it. He created a vision of Judaism in which everyone had to be Mordecai Kaplan. And he was an extraordinary thinker, an extraordinary person, sometimes a bit of a nudnik, honestly. Um, but people couldn't do that, wouldn't do that. So it didn't work. The Kehillah was tried once before his time. It was a dismal failure. Even synagogues that have attempted to organize in more democratic ways end up still having insiders, outsiders, people to center, people to periphery. They hire professionals who end up doing a lot of things. It didn't play out the way he wanted it to. Another challenge, and this could be the time he lived in, he really focused a lot on ideas and on social structure. I don't think he anticipated the turn of Western culture inward. That many, many people, when they walk a spiritual path, they're looking for deep meaning. They're looking for expressions of emotionality. They're looking to tap into a deeper kind of wonder. He's not the first rigorous thinker in the history of our people who were so smart that nobody could really follow what he was talking about. Maimonides, the most, I think, brilliant thinker of the medieval period, got swamped by Kabbalah, by Jewish mysticism. By the 16, 1700s, Kabbalah had become the last unifying theology of the entire Jewish people. Maimonides is often quoted in the details, but not followed. People don't live Guide for the Perplexed lives except for a handful of philosophers. So, in the same way or related way, Kaplan really addressed the mind. And while he himself was, I'm told, a deeply emotional and engaged person, that doesn't come across in his writings. His writings are about social structure and about clarity of ideas. But that's not why a lot of people turn to religion. They now turn to religion because they want to be moved, because they want to be elevated, because they want a sense of belonging, and sometimes they want to be swept away. That's not the Judaism that Kaplan articulated. Um, there's a challenge in his emphasis on self-fulfillment as salvation. If salvation is about self-fulfillment, then what do you need Judaism for? Like why bother with that? So there's an odd way, and he was so engaged in Judaism that I don't think he even saw it. That if it's purely about self-fulfillment, you can do that sometimes better outside of the Jewish community, right? And you don't really have an argument for why you have to engage this ancient tradition, these holiday cycles, these people, if your fulfillment is elsewhere. Um, and the biggest thing, I think, what he never anticipated was the resurgence and the resilience of orthodoxy. I think you'd have been just as surprised. The dominant form of Christianity was Methodism. And for a long time, Methodism was the religion of American presidents. Boy, it's on the wane now. I'm not saying that is a good or a bad thing. I'm just telling you the neighborhood of Christianity that has got a sense of mission and booming is the more evangelical branches. Similarly, those branches of Judaism still by far a minority, but the ones that get people going to yeshivot, get people dancing at the kotel, is a pretty black hat orthodoxy. And not just modern orthodoxy, but like really seriously Hasidische Mitnagdirs. So that really traditional kind of Judaism, he expected that to wither out, to disappear. He thought that the pressures of American life and American values, A, would be so attractive that people would want those, and B, that orthodoxy in its holding on to medieval modes of being would just melt away. But it hasn't done that. If anything, orthodoxy has become much more sophisticated. They now have publishing presses that publish wonderful publications that look stunning and beautiful. And there is a sense of triumph and triumphalism among Chabad, among Aish Torah, among many of the Orthodox, aided and abetted by their relationship to Israel. Which leads me to the next thing. Don't throw a rock. I don't think it ever occurred to him that that little tiny socialist experiment would become right wing. But the Israel that triumphed after Menachem Begin and Bibi Netanyahu, good or bad, I'll let you decide for yourself, is not the little kibbutz socialists of the founding generations. The Labor Party is a shell of what it once was. And what has moved into its place is this kind of orthodox nationalism that is militaristic, that is intolerant, and that actively rejects modern content. It utilizes modern methods, but not the content. And that is drawing people to it. Now, the vast majority of Jews in Israel, in America, still don't follow that kind of orthodoxy. It's still around 20%, but it has the energy. The more liberal forms of Jewish life, renewal, reconstruction, conservative reform, are on the defensive. And they may still have numerically larger numbers. Nobody can tell the future. Nobody knows where that's going to go. Last thing I want to say by way of predictions, um, he never anticipated, I don't think, that a majority of the world's Jews would be living in the land of Israel. Now, that's a combination of the Holocaust, and when he was writing, that hadn't happened yet. But it's also the dynamism of Zionism and how Jewish communities flocked to Israel when they couldn't flock elsewhere. And now the national growth rates in the land of Israel. Um, it is clear that either now or very soon, a majority of Jews living will live in Israel. That changes the world. When I was a kid, we had a plate to serve food on, and there were pictures of bagels and New York. Now the plate is palm trees and Jerusalem. That symbolic shift reflects something real and powerful that also mitigates against Kaplan's analysis of modernity. There's been a Jewish circling of the wagons. Again, good or bad, you decide. I'm just describing. So, what succeeded and what's next? I want to use the little time remaining to wrap up with that and then take comments and questions. I think his greatest contribution was what he called transnaturalism. He argued against two extremes. One was supernaturalism, this kind of idea that there's a non-physical, non-time-bound reality that supervenes on material reality. And material reality is a kind of reductionism. It's made up of its component parts, and um, it's not living. So nature is inert. Nature has no consciousness. And because of that, and that's the dominant worldview of contemporary science, that nature is made up of things that bang into each other on the outside. They don't have self-awareness, they don't have self-determination, and mindfulness becomes what's impossible to explain. Where did consciousness come from in that? Where did self-awareness come from? Where did self-determination come from? Contemporary metaphysics can't do that. And doesn't have an answer for that because it's bad metaphysics. So he comes up with what he considers a middle step. Transnaturalism is trying to account for the fact that in a natural world, no supernatural, there are things that a mechanistic understanding can't explain. The yearnings we have. How do you explain that part and parcel of our own identity is tied up in things we will never attain in our own lives? We raise children and grandchildren knowing we won't be around to see where that winds up. And yet it is vitally important to us. We can't imagine ourselves without that future generation orientation, even though it's beyond our reach. The aspirations for social justice. Many of us are engaged in our own ways in trying to make the world a better place, even though we know we will never live to see a perfect world. But that notwithstanding, we can't imagine what it would mean to live our lives not oriented to these goals that are beyond our grasp. And that yearning is a core part of being human and is built into nature, says Kaplan. That's what transnaturalism is, a nature that's not just mechanistic, but that also includes aspirations incapable of being realized on the level of machines. I have a personal criticism. Because he was a naturalist, he understood that a personal God was impossible. But here's what, if I had a chance to sit with Kaplan, I'd bring out Whitehead and I would try to say, look, mindfulness bubbled up in a purely natural way, which is to say, I think mindfulness is in nature from the very beginnings. And it becomes more and more complex and more visible over the time of evolution, but it was always there. It wasn't just a cherry plopped on the top. And if that's the case, then what personhood is, a sense of mind, a sense of self-determination, God can be purely natural and still exemplify mind. If anything, in fact, God is the mindfulness out of which our mindfulness emerges. In which case, you could have a personal God, meaning a God with personality, with will, with character, one who meets us in dialogue, because we're not solid objects either. We are events becoming over time, and so is God. We are processes, God is a process. Um, and Kaplan, I don't think ever really entertained that idea, but that feels to me the core next step, and that I get from process thought and process theology, but it feels very important. Last thing I want to say, he also rejects chosenness as being intrinsically biased. If you're going to say God chose us, you're making a claim of superiority and of the relative worthlessness of other people. But here I want to push back as well. It does look to me pretty astonishing, the pervasiveness of chosenness, even in non-Western cultures. Communities don't have to have Jews to have a sense of our being chosen and of hating us. That pervasive anti-Semitism, coupled with chosenness, is one of the facts of human history. Just to give you an example, have you noticed there are 0.3% of the population is Jews, and yet the English language has a word for that sector of humanity that are not Jewish, right? They're called in English Gentiles. But has it occurred to you that how weird it is that the English language has a word for the 99.97% of humanity? We don't have a single word for not Chinese. That would be very helpful because about one of every four is Chinese, right? We don't have a word for everyone who's not Muslim or not Christian, right? But there's a word in most languages for not Jewish. There's a sense in which our distinctiveness is one of the building blocks of human civilization. And in that regard, I personally don't think it's a theological claim. I think it's a historical claim. Um, so I would bring that back too. There's more to say, but I know I've gone on a while, and I want to make sure we have time for your concerns and your questions and your statements. So I'm going to turn it back to Matt and to let him um, appear again and help talk to us about some of the other people's questions.
Wonderful. Thank you, Rabbi, for such an engaging and thought-provoking conversation. And we have a number of questions that have come in, and for those of you out there, please feel free to continue to send them to us. To get us started, somebody asked, Reconstructionism seems very similar to Reform Judaism in its concepts. Is this incorrect?
Well, let's start with Kaplan's idea of an organism. Right. Organisms have an internal way of coordinating themselves and holding together, and two organisms of different species might resemble each other in some ways. So, look, both Reform Judaism and Reconstructionist Judaism are modern versions of Judaism. So they're going to have all of that in common. They're going to have history in common. They're going to have a lot of texts in common. The fact that both of them are not coercive, meaning they both think that Jewish practice is decided either by individuals or by community, they have that in common too. Um, but I think a big part of what makes them look similar uh, is the fact that um, they're very different than orthodoxy, right? And in that regard, conservative, Reconstructionism for many years was a branch of conservative Judaism. There's an enormous overlap there as well. So The fact that they have a lot in common, I attribute to the fact that they're both liberal ways of being Jewish, and they're dealing with those social issues that I laid out at the beginning. Every contemporary form of Jewish life is wrestling with those challenges.
Thank you. We've received a few questions about theology. Two in particular are people who are familiar with some of your work, asking about process theology and if it's similar to Kaplan's conception. Um, yeah, that's basically the question. How does your theology similar to Kaplan's?
Okay, so a quick word. I'm very much a fan of Whitehead and of process thought. Process thought says that everything is in a process of becoming, not of being, that everything interacts relationally, including the divine. And the divine is what holds us together and provides us with coherence and also with the capacity to follow good choices, which process people call the lure. That is very similar to Kaplan's later thought for sure. And Kaplan was aware of Whitehead, and many of his concepts are adjacent. I think one of the big differences, and here I am going to be critical, um, Kaplan pegged himself to a mechanistic view of nature that he ultimately tried to liberate himself from with transnaturalism, but he didn't have a framework for it. And Whitehead created a metaphysical system in which he recognizes that systemically nature is not just a big dead machine. And so he comes up with a system for understanding that in which his religiosity makes sense. Kaplan's religiosity, to me, in some way threatens to collapse into culture. Another reason I think why it's had challenging success, people turn to religion often for existential crises, but culture abandons you at that moment. When you are so sick that you turn your face to the wall and you're going to die, the fact that pointillism is a way of painting is irrelevant to you. And if Judaism is just a cultural expression of the Jewish people, then what does it have for you in that moment? But because Whitehead's is a metaphysics that explains how the universe holds together, there's a place for process religion, process Judaism all the way through. And that feels to me like a big improvement.
Thank you. Also, I believe this question is primarily on the theology front. And, how was Rabbi Harold Schulweis, his student, able to popularize some of Kaplan's ideas more successfully?
uh, so Harold Schulweis and Harold Kushner, the two Harolds, were both Reconstructionist in their thought and conservative affiliated in practice. I think that that's because both of them thought there had to be a mechanism by which change was engaged communally. And they thought that the law committee of the conservative movement could be that mechanism. They were very critical of the slow pace of the conservative movement's change. I think that's still an issue, honestly. Um, but without a structure that's authoritative, and Kaplan recognizes this too, it threatens to collapse into just personal preferences. And so I think they were fighting for a kind of reconstructionist remake of conservative Judaism, which in many ways has happened. The conservative movement now ordains LGBT people, it ordains men and women and intersex people. There is a way in which that openness has over time transformed the conservative movement, but I think they saw their place structurally within conservative Judaism. But why was his more popular? Both both Herolds, Schulweis and Kushner, were master practitioners. There, you can listen to Harold Schulweis's sermons. They're astonishingly good. And so he was able to popularize these ideas without a sense of jargon, without being stuck in intellectual cogitation, which Kaplan, I think, was not able to find a way to do in the same way. So Many of what they were doing was popularizing these ideas, but they were geniuses who found ways to speak to the human heart, not just the human mind. And that is why they're more popular.
Thank you. And on that note, somebody asked, Kaplan apparently was a rather difficult fellow. Had he been easier to like and get along with, do you think his philosophy might have been caught on better? Some related to what you just said. Do you think his personality related to some of it?
So I never met him, and I'm very leery about thinking that a biographer knows his temperament. Biographers know the public record, and they know it from someone's perspective. They don't know the inner thinking. They don't know what motivated his fears. They don't know his private life that wasn't recorded down. I don't want to sit in judgment of Kaplan's character. I know that the people who were his students adored him. Um, and he certainly was not the only prickly person to be a Jewish thought leader. So no, I don't think that's it, and I'm not comfortable trying to assess if he had only been psychoanalyzed, that maybe then Reconstructionism would have taken over the world.
Thank you. Um, Somebody noted that they're dual affiliated as a Reconstructionist and a Jewish humanist, and that you haven't mentioned, you did not reference humanists or seculars, and he or she was curious as to why, or if you have anything further to say about.
Look, again, when it comes to Jewish denominationalism, I'm very much Darwinian, let 100 flowers blossom. I wish humanist Judaism all the best. Um, I think what Kaplan's challenge would be with humanist Judaism is its forswearing God language. Kaplan really was a God intoxicated individual. He just meant by it something different than what Art Scroll means. And the abandonment of it, he resented when people called him an atheist. Um, so I think that there are ways in which he made very different choices, although bottom line ended up in many similar places. Driven by people and human values, he considered himself a religious humanist, but he also considered himself a theist. So lots in common. Again, as with what we said about Reform or conservative Judaism, huge overlap, and then some distinctive choices, which for me in the larger picture is good because Judaism isn't going to be one size fits all without cutting some people out. So if we want to be able to embrace the largest amount, then we have to be willing to embrace different and incompatible ways of being Jewish as legitimate.
Thank you. And another question here, uh, going back to earlier in your talk, could authority in rabbinic Judaism also come from a life and practice in accord with Torah, even for someone not of proper, quote, stock, that is proper birth roots and status?
So I'm not sure what proper birth roots and status means for your questioner. Maybe if the questioner wants to clarify that, I can answer with more precision. Certainly, all the rabbis were Jewish. Not all of the rabbis were Jewish by birth. There were prominent rabbis in the Talmudic period who came to Judaism, and Judaism recognizes them as sages and scholars. So you don't have to be born Jewish, but to be able to be a practitioner of halacha, you have to be bound by it. And in that sense, you have to be inside it. So I'm not sure if that's what your questioner was asking or if they're asking something different than that. Do you
Thank
have
you.
a...
Well, I don't have, they have, nothing has come up on my screen yet, so we'll see if they are still with us this evening and want to write anything else.
Okay.
Um, there's a few questions about Reconstructionist Judaism and Kaplan's influence on the Jewish community. One person asked about whether or not it influenced the growth of Jewish community centers, and one person more generally asked how it's impacted some of the if it's impacted Jewish and non-Jewish theologies.
Yes, so look, he is both a reflection of his time and an influencer of his time. Um, Certainly, the growth of JCCs and of what are called synagogue centers, shul with a pool, that's Kaplanian. That came from Mordecai Kaplan, and was his contribution that synagogues should be places where there's a Jewish way to play basketball. There's a Jewish way to take care of the hungry or the poor, and that should happen. A synagogue should not just be a place for praying. It should be a place for building community. The fact that many synagogues now have Israeli dancing is a cultural expression. Many synagogues have vibrant art programs, literature, culture programs that they see as part and parcel of their Jewishness. That's Mordecai Kaplan's influence. And then he's had an influence on the other denominations. The Reform movement is far more open and embracing of ritual practice than it was in its classical period. That's the impact of Kaplan. The conservative movement is far more open to changing Jewish law when it needs to evolve. That's the influence of Kaplan. He raised a generation of rabbis who lobbied for those kinds of shifts consciously and unconsciously. And even the people who drew a line at saying, I am not a Kaplanian, couldn't help but being influenced by many of his better ideas.
Um, Similarly, like what areas of observance did Kaplan believe were a matter of individual or personal choice, and which ones are more communal and congregational?
I don't think Kaplan made a distinction between the two, meaning he doesn't think that ritual observance is coercive. So whether you keep kosher or not, whether you keep it consistently or not, whether you um, keep kosher according to this code or that code, I don't think Kaplan would weigh in on that. He didn't think there could be a meaningful Judaism without ritual behaviors. Ritual teaches and reminds us of our belonging and our commitments and our identity. So there has to be some, and then the parameters of it are more communally driven in the sense that you have to decide what's permissible for Kiddush at your synagogue or at your JCC. What are they going to serve? What days are they going to close for holidays? What's going to be read on the holiday? What prayer book are you going to use? Those are all collective communal decisions. I don't think he weighed in on, if you're a member of this synagogue, then you should be praying this number of times every day. That he really left to the individual. He's not expecting the synagogues to police certain ritual standards, but we have to agree as a community who gets to be called to the Torah and who doesn't. That he saw as communal.
Did Mordecai Kaplan ever try to harmonize modern cosmology and Maimonides theology in any way?
Not that I'm aware of. He was a great lover, an admirer of Maimonides' thought. You can see a through line from Rambam to Kaplan in many, many ways. So Kaplan is standing on the shoulders of Maimonides in many, many places. Look, Maimonides was the first to kind of redefine God. Rambam teaches that anything we say about God is inaccurate. We have to keep talking because there's no way to not discuss it. But God is beyond all human understanding, all human definition, all human language. That's very close to Kaplan moving to come up with a different content-filled definition. So he's very influenced by Rambam, but I'm not familiar with his writing explicitly about the similarities of, a reconstructionist view of Mordecai of Moses Maimonides. I'm not familiar with that. Be an interesting paper to write.
Well, I was going to save this question for a bit later, but on this note, somebody did just ask, do you have any plans to do some writing on Kaplan's theology? Um,
I do not. Um, I'm working on two books right now. One, the one that is in my bio has been accepted for publication, and that's really making the argument that to understand Judaism as a statement of identity and values, not a statement of theological belief. And I want to get that out there because I think for a lot of American Jews, that is in fact how they understand their Jewishness, and I want to give them a path forward. And then I want to write a more popular book that I'm tentatively calling The Water Wants You to Float. That in an age of anxiety and rage and loneliness such as ours, people have within themselves the capacity to heal and to thrive, and I want to point that out to them.
Wonderful. We look forward to those, and we will hopefully have you back when these books become published. So
That would be great. I would love that.
another question here. This was noted. It's not hard to imagine that sufficient reconstruction and democratic adjustment could lead to something that bears almost no resemblance to classic Judaism. Um, will we still be Jewish at that point? Does that matter enough to establish guardrails to somehow maintain us as Jews?
Great question. So here's a Kaplanian answer to that question. I don't know that would be how Kaplan would answer it, but here's a Kaplanian answer. Judaism in every age is both continuous and discontinuous with the Judaism of a previous age, right? So if you lived in First Temple times, then prayer would be spontaneous and marginal. Um, what Jewish religion would be sacrificing goats and sheep and oxen and offering grain offerings and wine and oil offerings. That was what being a religious Jew was. And it meant having a Davidic king on a throne in Jerusalem. That hasn't been Judaism for over 2,000 years. And yet we still think of it as Judaism. So again, the challenge is what your society thinks is Judaism feels natural and timeless to you as a member of your society. But Judaism has changed drastically in each age, some ways visible, some ways invisible. So I don't think Kaplan would say that you can't put on guardrails. You know, you'll put on guardrails and your children will come back to you and say, we're not doing that, or we're not doing it that way. Each generation rebels against its predecessors. What you can try to do is create a compelling community that our children's children identify with and want to be part of it. That will be the continuity. But peoplehood is at the center. So long as there's a sense of peoplehood that leads to a rich Jewish civilization, that will be the level of continuity, not the content of what they do or read or sing.
Wonderful. On that note, somebody just wrote, I understood that Kaplan said tradition has a vote, but not a veto. Is this correct or close to the Reconstructionist view?
Yes, I think that's a good, I don't know if he actually said that, but it is a very good summation of his Reconstructionism at the time that Kaplan was writing was much more open to traditional learning and practice than were the reform structures of its time, and much more open to seeing Judaism as a civilization than just a good idea. Um, so, but he absolutely did not feel that previous generations get to veto the needs of this generation. That he thought was part of the death of Judaism in America. He wanted to liberate us from that kind of servitude.
Thank you. A few people have asked about good and evil or bad in the world and wondering what Kaplan would say about bad things happening to good people and similar questions to that.
He was against it. Um, Kaplan, when he talks about evil and suffering, which is a classical issue in religion, has a very different approach. And for those of us who are philosophical, very unsatisfying in some ways. So for Kaplan, natural evil and human evil are two very distinct things. Why people do really bad things, why cultures sometimes will go off the rails and do really bad things is not a theological issue for him. That's a psychological and sociological issue, and Judaism should provide us with the resources to resist. Um, Natural evil is for him a brute fact. There's no explaining that any more than there's an explaining of gravity. Gravity doesn't have a purpose, it just is. And life has evolved making room for it. So the correct response to evil and to suffering is what are you doing to minimize the suffering? Are you funding scientific research, engaging in scientific research if you have the capacity, visiting the sick, providing meals, holding people's hands, making sure they're not lonely, making sure they're not in pain? What are you doing to alleviate the suffering of your fellow human beings? It's an action concern, not a theological question. He doesn't want to sit and say, oh, that's interesting. Let's think about that. He wants you to roll up your sleeves and do something about it. So for him, that's the response to evil, not a book of theology.
Thank you. And as we come to a close, there's two final questions here. One is several people have asked about Israel and what would Kaplan think of the Jewish community's relationship with Israel today. One person noted, especially with the increasing anti-Zionism in Reconstructionist communities and a number of other communities.
I'm going to sidestep the last part of that comment and address myself to the first. Kaplan defined himself as a Zionist, but he was an Ahad Ha'am kind of Zionist, a cultural Zionist. He felt that Israel ought to be the civilizational center of the Jewish people. He did not think that every Jew had an obligation to live there. He felt that every Jew had an obligation to feel rooted in it. I think he would have been very troubled by many of the political choices Israel has made over the past many years. He also would have been amazed at many of the choices Israel has made and many of the contributions that Israel has made. He very firmly believed in the centrality of Hebrew language. He would have loved the flowering of Hebrew fiction and poetry and culture that Israel has generated. And he would have been urging Jews to keep their hearts supple and open to embrace all people in the area. So I don't think he would have been moved much by the current dominant politics, but Israel, like any country, is far bigger than its politics. And I don't think he could have imagined a reconstructionist movement that wasn't profoundly Zionist in that sense.
Thank you. And just as a final question, somebody asked, what do you see as the future of Kaplan's ideas and the Reconstructionist movement? And I'll make it more broad for you also if there's anything you want to leave us with this evening.
So I think that Kaplan's analysis of what the challenges, the gaps between traditional Judaism and Western culture are spot on. You don't have to like his solutions to notice that his diagnosis of the problem is brilliant and honest. And I think hopefully what we'll get from Kaplan at the very least is a commitment to being honest in our analysis of the problems. Two, his recognition that Judaism is bigger than religion, that it is the life breath of the Jewish people. I believe with all my heart that that is true. Judaism didn't become a religion until we went into exile. Religion is a Latin term, it's a Roman concept. We became a religio to fit into Roman categories. But there's no word for religion in the Hebrew Bible because it's not our concept. There's nothing that isn't. Um, so I think that the return of Jews to their homeland, accompanied by the recognition that Judaism is bigger than a creed, a theology, a set of practices. It is the living breath of the Jewish people. I think that's actually a wonderful return to a healthier perspective. And I assume that that has already had an influence across every denomination. And all those American Jews who, when polled, say they don't practice a religion and that being Jewish is very important to them. Right? One of those astonishing statistics. The fastest growing subgroup within Judaism today is none of the above. And if you ask those people whether Judaism is trivial, important, or very important, about 80% say very important or important. So it's clear that for American Jews, they need to have a way of thinking about religion, about Judaism, that's bigger than a creed, bigger than a theology, because that's not what they're living in. And that Kaplan provides really helpful tools for.
Thank you once again, Rabbi Artson, for sharing your expertise and your thoughts with us. It's been a really wonderful evening with you
My
tonight. So
pleasure. Thank you, everybody. Good to spend time together.